it's Judy Collins' a remix of her 1971 recording of Amazing Grace, which had a lot to do with the kind of resurgence of interest in that hymn. And not too long ago, maybe a decade and a half ago, she went back and took that recording and had a huge choir dubbed over or within it. So it's quite a lovely rendition of Amazing Grace. But I have to get out of the PowerPoint to go get this, and I'm worried that I'll get stuck in a loop with technology. So what I'm going to do is something counterintuitive to start with. It's kind of what I did last week, is I wanted to talk about intimations of great vastness and great love in the universe or in a system with God's from other religions' points of view. So I want to read some things from you. I'm going to read 3 of the sutras from the Radiance Sutras, and the Radiance Sutras were they're a yogic practice. It came out of Sanskrit. It's quite old. I'm reading from a new translation of the Radiant Sutras. So this was used for yogic practices and in Buddhist practice. I'm going to read, I'll start with 72. You can see it. But it spoke to me about some things that I was thinking about regarding what the concept of grace means to us in the Christian religion. So this is 72. The universe is here to reveal unlimited splendor, infinite diversity of expression. No one can withstand her allure. Adore the colors and shapes of her enchantment, and know the one who permeates it all is a great lover, deeply relating above and below, mortal and immortal, transient and eternal. Perceive the terrifying beauty. Be free to suffer and to be thrilled, to tolerate intolerable ravishment. And then Sutra 34. The air I am breathing was exhaled in ecstasy by an ancient sun. This earth I am standing on was born of cosmic fire. The blood flowing through my veins is as salty as the primordial ocean. The space permeating my body is infinite as the space all around. Above, below, to all sides within, the elements of the universe are engaged in their ceremony of delight. This is my religion. The attraction between suns is the same as the love pulsating in my heart. And then Sutra 26. The one who is at play everywhere says, there is a space in the heart where everything meets. Come here if you want to find me. Mind, senses, soul, eternity, all are here. Are you here? Enter the bowl of vastness that is the heart. Listen to the song that is always resonating. Give yourself to it with total abandon. Quiet ecstasy is here, and a steady, regal sense of resting in a perfect spot. You who are the embodiment of blessing, once you know the way, the nature of attention will call you to return. Again and again, answer that call and be saturated and knowing, I belong here, I am at home. Anyway, I thought those were interesting sutras that speak to the felt experience, the inhaled experience of some vastness that lies within the human being and that attaches to the vastness of the universe. which I think is one of the ways that sometimes people can think about grace and grace itself. So that's the yogic practice part of the Buddhist tradition. And this is, of course, is an old sculpture, a temple sculpture of the Buddha. At the moment of enlightenment, the prince reaches his right hand down towards the ground in a gesture or mudra, and specifically the Bhamasvarmas mudra of calling the earth to witness his spiritual awakening. In doing so, he becomes the Buddha. So it's the moment of, this sculpture captures that moment of awakening, that sense of seeing into the truth of the universe. And this is, now, okay, here's another kind of glimpse of something called grace, although it's hard to know the best translation of the word in Sanskrit. In Hinduism, the concept, and it's central in one of the, is it still on me?
Yes.
I feel like I've got a tail here. Sorry. When my jacket starts speaking, we'll be in trouble, as long as it's in tongues. Okay, here it is. Okay, this is too much. Sorry, I was just going to swallow.
The wardrobe girl called in drunk this morning. I got it.
Okay.
No, this will go down
Okay.
now instead of go.
Careful, sharp. Don't forget your glasses sitting there on the floor. You're crazy.
Oh, I can't get it all together. Thank you. Thank you. So, especially in Bhakti yoga and the Bhakti reform movement within Hinduism, there is this concept of grace. There are references in translation to grace in the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of those epic poems that is thousands of years old. It's not its concept of grace as God's gift, except in this Southern reform movement, it's understood as God offering grace to the believers. In the Gita, this figure, Kripa is a state rather than, it can be figured as a God. It's described by Krishna as a process of surrendering to the divine with faith and an attitude of loving contemplation through which the devout finds liberation from cyclical rebirth. In other words, it is a conduit to moving beyond the cycle, the endless cycle of rebirth into nirvana. And so there are ways in which there are traces of this kind of this desire for some kind of attachment to God or gods in various religions. Now, in indigenous American spirituality, there's a sense of the sacredness of seeing the world as a fantastic and beautiful creation, engendering extremely powerful feelings of gratitude and indebtedness. And that's an aspect of that's observable in many of the manifestations of Indigenous American spirituality. And the notion of the sacredness of the Great Spirit and of Mother Earth, and the ongoing process of the revelation of the kinship of humans with all of the universe, with land, with animals, with vegetation. And the importance also within Indigenous spirituality of a habit of gratitude, of feeling of overwhelming love and thankfulness for the gifts of the Creator or the Great Spirit. And here are a couple why this freezes, I don't know. I've got this on text, so if you fiddle with it, and so one of the things I had on one of the screens was from Chief Luther Standing Bear from the late 19th century, speaking to the Lakota Nation of the Great Mystery, and he is reported to have said, "From Wankantanka, the Great Spirit, there came a great unifying life force that flowed in and through all things, the flowers of the plains, blowing winds, rocks, trees, birds, animals, and was the same force that had been breathed into the first man." There it is. "Thus all things were kindred and were brought together by the same great mystery." And then this one? There it is. Nope, that's not. It went back to the beginning. And then there's another quote I have from Chief Yellowlark at the end of the 19th century too. A prayer. "O Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds and whose breath gives life to all of the world, hear me. I am small and weak. I need your strength and wisdom. Let me walk in beauty and make my eyes ever behold the red and purple sunset. Make my hands respect the things you have made and my ears sharp to hear your voice. Make me wise so that I may understand the things you have taught my people. Let me learn the lessons you have hidden in every leaf and rock. I seek strength not to be superior to my brother, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make me always ready to come to you, so when life fades as a fading sunset, my spirit will come to you without shame." So those are some of the ways in which other spiritual traditions glimpse the beyond, glimpse the power of love, glimpse something like God or enlightenment or wisdom. Okay. So now what I want to do is I wanted to show you a painting, but it's not going down, right? Okay, skip saying grace at meals. Grace. It's about lunchtime, so we'll just say grace. Okay, yeah. Okay, and this is, I don't know why this quote isn't fully on this, but this is from the series Images of Grace, and it's called Sacrificial Grace. And Fujimura says, "Art mirrors this struggle and captures the process of letting go. Every stroke pushes the painting to sacrifice itself. Every creative act destroys something previously built. Imagination reveals not new vistas, but revelations of the reality, or of the reality, yes, beyond reality." So that's how he talks about what he's trying to capture in this very slow process. That sense about as a Christian, for him, what grace reveals is the reality beyond reality. Okay, so now what I want you to do is take a few minutes, and I want you to jot down, if you can jot down words that you associate with your concept of grace. And I have pencils coming. They're on their way around. Let me take some to put over here. Okay.
Thank you.
You don't have to try to be coherent or have a full system of grace. Everybody got something? Okay. Okay, everybody got something down? All right, let's just throw out some of the, you don't have to say it, everything that's on your sheet, but some of the words that you use to when you're trying to capture what you think the concept of grace is. I say that not because I don't think you know what the concept of grace is by saying you think this is what it is. Just how do you talk to yourself? How do you tell yourself about grace? So anybody want to throw out a word?
Another chance.
Another chance.
A gift.
A gift.
Unearned.
What?
Connection.
Connection.
Unconditional.
Assurance.
Unconditional.
Unconditional.
Belonging.
Acceptance. Forgiveness.
Mercy.
I said unmerited favor.
Unmerited favor.
Freedom. Freedom.
Freedom.
I say sunshine.
Sunshine. Okay. Okay. All right. We've got some words to go with. And let's take a look at some of these and let's think about the words we use. Okay. So here's just some definitions. The free and unmerited favor of God. Unmerited divine assistance given to humans for their regeneration and sanctification. Those are fancy words, regeneration and sanctification. They sound momentous. Nobody's threw in sanctification in this group. I think Presbyterians are very uncomfortable with something like sanctification. But nonetheless, okay, another way is God's action in the world. Instead of thinking about grace as something that's given, one can think about it as an act, as an action, as God's action The love that bridges the distance or space between God and humans. It might be, that's using a metaphor of the bridge, a bridge between the ineffable and our own wounded selves. The light that illuminates the accessibility of God, sunshine. Sometimes people think about, anybody have that image sometimes of this great lightness that kind of shows through things. The arrow of God's desire for vulnerable humans. I think I did something, I said something last week, or I read a quote that was about ask a question, what does God desire of humans? So we can see grace as God and the kind of expression of God's desire for connection. That's to turn things around slightly, right? It's to talk about God as the receiver of our willingness to accept grace, or of thinking about what God desires. We usually don't talk about that. What is a desiring God? Because that usually veers off, and sometimes we think about sexuality or some kind of eroticism. But I'll just throw that out there. So we have this, we have, let me see. I'm going to talk about, so we have these different ways of talking about what we think grace is. You were talking, you sent me a note. Why don't you talk about your metaphor that you wrote me about?
Okay, and actually I brought the email just because it's easier to read than it is to rethink it through every time. I'm getting too old to remember all of it, so there we go. So I started from the fact, and it's always on my mind, that the churches nowadays are really worried about the fact that people are not going to church anymore. And it happened back in the early days of the church too, where the theology was trying to reconcile with philosophy, and John was able to do that. And we have had centuries of people talking about theology and philosophy and how they work together. But in my experience in this last century, people were talking more about science. So I'm wondering, can we reconcile theology with science? And so starting from that point, I went to physicist Stephen Hawking's book on the universe in a nutshell, and one of his graphics in there was of the distribution and density of gravity on a grid on a horizontal plane in space. Okay, so you can think of it as like a trampoline. Okay, very flexible, up and down and all that sort of thing. Depending on the weight or the draw of something, it changes shape. So it says, bear with me, the following will take a bit to explain. My newly updated pronoun for God is they, them. The pronouns in English are not gendered because God is not gendered, and this term compensates for belief in the Trinity. It probably won't work for anybody who approaches the issue from the perspective of strict monotheism without doing a backflip. So, as for God's location, in my understanding, God created time and space, and therefore lives outside of them. Humans exist and must exist inside time and space and cannot know any other condition because we do not know where the boundaries are located. We are also definitely not compatible with the physical and spiritual conditions that meet God's requirements to exist, or we would be there with them now in some fashion. This is a case where oil and water do not mix. Purity in the sight of God and undecayed bodies seem to be extremely important, and those attributes do not describe humans. Therefore, if we want to exist outside of time and space, we must meet the contextual and environmental conditions that make that possible. We can lose our earthly bodies to death, but we believe our spirits go elsewhere and are enveloped in new bodies. In truth, only God has the ability to move us beyond our existential boundaries. This is where God's grace through salvation comes in. God provided for our way to their side of the boundary line through Christ because we could not do it for ourselves. In my imagination, a working metaphor for what this system of grace can be, and a metaphor for how God might choose to work under these conditions, is a flexible grid where the lines are not permanently fixed at any point. Rather, they can shift into any configuration as they are poked or prodded. Otherwise, they are in continual random motion. The lines represent the lives of people, historical events, and divine phenomena. Their undirected convergence at various times and places explains the randomness of everyday life. If the grid dips purposefully at one spot, people, events, and phenomena come together and end up with a miracle like the wedding at Cana wine story. Many converging lines in certain characteristics can budge together for a war. In the case of miracles, certain lines converge because God manipulated particular lines to accomplish something good to further a purpose. The life of Christ and the crucifixion could be described the same way. God's grace, or manipulation, made it possible for God to break into a spot on the time-space grid, something where the bright lines only converged once. God's grace personally guided the grid lines to a certain place where such an anomaly could happen. God has power over creation and can use it as they wish, after all.
Now that's quite an
Painting.
no, but it's quite an elaborate way, a metaphor to use. I mean, through taking a metaphor from wherever it's useful for you, like Stephen Hawking's physics of the universe, and trying to, because we only have the kind of knowledge that we have and the metaphors that we have available to us in our culture, to find a way to describe something that's hard to define and describe. So any responses to that metaphor or to this concept of grace?
It needs a PowerPoint.
Huh?
It needs a
PowerPoint, yeah. But there were other metaphors of light, the sun as a metaphor. What when you look at the words you've used, what is the strongest metaphor you use for something like grace? For grace, not something like grace.
Beauty.
That's mine too.
Beauty.
Beauty, okay, kind of maybe the concept of the sublime. I mean, that's a kind of literary concept that goes with the romantics of the 19th century, but there is a notion of that, of feeling connected to something of the sublime, something that's almost beyond words to describe. Other things that your words were working at. It's okay. I mean, anything come to mind now about another kind of metaphor that you could find useful to think about? Say, what would you answer to the question, how does grace make you feel? You remember how I asked that question last week about what's the feeling of God? What's the feeling that we have when we use the term God? Well, what feelings are evoked for you when you're thinking about grace?
I was thinking today in church that it felt like in
inside it was blooming like a flower.
Okay, so a kind of, we would call that fecundity, some kind of arising from within, but as plants arise out of the ground, and a kind of, describe what you feel about that, a kind of,
Opening.
okay, something like cracking open or opening up to turn the inside out. That would be another, the growth of the plants that you were referencing is like, how do you take something that's hidden and in germ form and then it bursts forth? So an opening out. What about other things? Yeah.
The sensation of the peace of Christ.
Okay, so a kind of, can you describe the feeling of peace?
Calmness, no matter what the environment, no matter what the sense of tension, it's just a calmness and a certainty and a happiness.
Okay, and a sense of being present to oneself. Would that go with that peace? Being in the present and open to the vibrations of the universe or the grid of the universe, you know?
I would add to that relief, because it's wonderful to know that God is in charge. God is very real to me, and I don't have to depend on myself for everything. God is there and has promised to watch over us.
Okay, a kind of sense of a sense of relief, also a sense of a homeness, of being at home in the universe and in oneself. Is that, what other, yeah.
Bill used the word acceptance, which I also used. And, that no matter what, we are accepted by God through His grace. So that's a feeling of relief and comfort and
Peace sometimes. Okay, other things? Yeah.
Well, if I would sit and think about grace, of course, the word amazing comes out, but just an overwhelming sense of awe that, boy, this is really something. And
Okay.
what a gift.
Okay, so, people have worked around this, that sense of the sublime, awe, peace, acceptance, and do any of you have a feeling that's in motion? We've been taught, a lot of these are about something coming on to us. Is there a way that we are inhabited by or glimpse grace and it puts us in motion in a certain way?
I would say enveloped, so that the grace was in motion as opposed to me being in motion.
Okay, so,
Working inside of a room full of Jell-O, kind of like.
okay, that's an interesting metaphor for it.
Sid,
Yeah,
I'll take that inside out and suggest it's surrender.
okay. So is it a moment where we feel that we can put our guard down, surrender to what is there being given to us? It's an interesting, because it could be possible to just be caught short at, or feeling a jerk in the soul. Yeah.
I think for me,
Aki?
it's the freedom as well, that it's very experiential, and then it's part of what I experience and who I am and my relationship with God. And so there's no prescribed formula of what grace is or how we should live and feel. So that freedom thing speaks to me.
Okay? Yeah.
I think also, instead of only feeling like it might be a jolt, it might also feel like it's an epiphany sometimes.
It's a what?
An epiphany.
Epiphany.
Where you're just the sensation of knowing for certain that Jesus is God. That would be one example.
Okay. Yeah.
I would say welcoming and belonging.
Welcoming, belonging. We've got some metaphors going. We've kind of considered the feelings that it is, whether it's action or a state of being or a state of mobilizing. I mean, for different people, it will be different kinds of experiences because you will use different or are using different kinds of metaphors for that. Now, I want to say a couple things. This is a weird way to think about it, but when I was doing reading this week, more theology than I've ever read, and I was lost in the weeds of the history of the concept of grace in the Christian church. But there's this concept that grace is, when we think about grace, what we really are engaging is the supernatural economy of God's love in the world. So, and people talk about this, it means that it's a process through which there are all parts of it, God's governance of the system of justification. We haven't talked about that, but in a certain understanding of what the cycle of grace is and the economy of grace, it's about justification and salvation. It's about creating new human beings that are just human beings, the love that brings the individual to a sense of what is just and good in the world. It's supernatural insofar as it's a call from God to participate in the friendship that's made available. That's the gift. And then this is the exclusive thing, only inside the economy of grace can we see what the true freedom is, and kind of slough or disabuse ourselves of our sense of our own free will in action in the world and think about the freedom to be able to love as God wants us to love, to inhabit the world through a doctrine of love, and that it's made available to all people. Then the question is the church part of this economy of grace? And for some theologians, the church is grace par excellence insofar as it's a visible manifestation of the relationship between God and the act of engracement. I don't know, what's the word for that, Mel?
Engracement?
Yeah, there is, I just made up that word, so there is no word called engracement. But the sense of being in a state of grace. And then just to remind you what justification and sanctification are. Justification, it's the state, I hate discussion of the state of sin because I have problems with doctrine of sin. But if you live in that space of a doctrine of sin, then it would be justification is the act by which, or the process by which God kind of brings human beings through this gift to a state of justice a state of being a just person and out of the state of grace. I mean, out of the state of sin. And the issue about kind of moving out of a state of, into a state of righteousness. And then in Protestantism, the act of acquittal whereby God gives contrite sinners the status of the righteous. For me, the issue becomes, can I believe in something called grace without subscribing to all of this? Can you, for some people, I think, who have trouble with what they believe, there are some things that we latch onto, the unbelieving latch onto. For me, it's grace. I get onto that bandwagon. Grace, yes, it's it's I can have a sense that I feel that. But after doing all this work this past week, then I kept asking myself, but you don't believe all the rest that's involved in this economy, supernatural economy of God's love through grace. So you're fooling yourself. I'm saying to myself, I'm fooling myself. But I just constantly struggle with it. Other people may struggle with it or not struggle with it. Because it gets at what you think about the figure of Jesus. Is he historical? Is he a historical prophet? Or is he, I can hardly say the words, the Son of God? So that, it seems to me, is one of the issues for the whole question about what is our relationship to grace. What does grace do for us individually? What does it do for us as a collective? Now, the other thing I'm mindful of, I'm gonna pass over this. This is another one of Makoto Fujimura's paintings called Grace Psalm. But it gets me to, okay, it doesn't get me to anything now because I'm back in that. I wanted to get to Dietrich Bonhoeffer because this is another place where I hit a wall in my own thinking, is reading Bonhoeffer on grace. Okay. Grace and freedom. No, I'm going to skip grace and freedom, not because I don't.
Oh, absolutely.
I see it's not. It just doesn't move. Let me read you. The reason I'm interested in Bonhoeffer is in the something of discipleship. What's that? The cost of discipleship. Okay, now you go to the next. I'm just trying to get to, okay. Oh, I'll come back to this. Let's go to the Bonhoeffer, the next one, I think. Nope. There. Okay. If you read Bonhoeffer on grace, for me, it's reading like being struck over the head with the distinction he makes between cheap grace and costly grace. And for him, the only kind of grace is costly grace. So cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. That kind of put me in my place. You know, I don't want to be guilty of cheap grace, but that's the state I'm in now. Costly grace, where probably most of you are, is the gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Now that's really interesting because we haven't talked about the obligation of the one who is the recipient of grace yet. What is required of us. And Bonhoeffer, of course, is saying, it's not like you just stand there and blah, blah, blah. You have to do something. You have to open the door. You have to knock. You have to ask. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it costs a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life, and that's the concept of the only true freedom. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. Ye were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. So, if any of you, some of you may have read Bonhoeffer, but I recommend taking a look at The Cost of Discipleship, because it's a kind of a very powerful kind of critique about the ease of unbelief within the context of a community of believers. And also a reminder of what it has cost God to I get stuck at what's the verb here, to make available to humans the action of grace, to forgive, to all the words that people used, to accept. So are there any thoughts that you have about his Bonhoeffer's kind of distinction between cheap grace and costly grace? Yeah, Phil.
Well, this may relate, may not, but I didn't bring up before a couple other words I'd written down, which indicates to me a feeling personal of what grace would be. It has a past and a future. It's a moving target. The past is forgiveness, cheap or costly, but always looking back and feeling internally that one has been forgiven. One forgives oneself.
Yeah.
And future is forbearance. The word forbearance knocks on what you're thinking you would be accepted in the future, except for yourself, except for whatever the concept of God is.
Mm-hmm.
But those two are really the moving timeline. There's forgiveness and forbearance in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't in any depth of Bonhoeffer.
No. But that's another way of thinking about it. Of sometimes we think about the action of grace as an instantaneous reaction, an instantaneous feeling, right? Struck by grace, struck by that sense of peace. And then what Bill's suggesting is, what if yes, that's a possible way to think about it. What if we think about it as in time, in real time? Because humans are on the real time of this, right? They aren't out of time. It's their possibility in real time of accessing or accepting something that speaks from the supernatural, but it's in time, and there's no end to being forgiven. And the other thing you brought up, which is really interesting, is this question of self-forgiveness. And thinking about grace as this multi-dimensional engagement through which we sense the power of divine forgiveness, but also glimpse a little bit inside us the godliness in us that allows us to forgive ourselves. So that there's some connection, some inspiriting of that act of forgiveness in ourselves. Okay, we've only started on this, but we've come a long way, I think, on thinking about grace. And I think what I'll do, I make too many, I have these nagging questions. I'll just throw them out. Why did the concept of grace come to be important in early Christianity? I mean, there's a reason for it, a desire for it. So for me, that would be kind of the sociopolitics of the early communities, picking up on the language that's in the sacred text, the biblical text, of course, but that's still a question. And then we talked a little bit, does one feel grace? What is required of those who come into the presence of God's grace? And we began to get a little bit of that at that. Where does grace go when it is communicated? This is one of those, how does it indwell? We've talked a little bit about that, but it's interesting to think about how we think of it as having it experienced inside, but how does it get inside? And then I mentioned is grace only accessible through belief in Christ? And one of the questions or one of the issues that's raised by liberation theologists. Do you know the liberation theologists came out of the Marxist movement in Latin America mostly? All the Catholic clergy, the priests and nuns who were involved in trying to liberate the huge number of masses during the revolutionary periods in Mexico and Central America and Latin America. The question for liberation theologists is, or the issue that they raise is, what is the social doctrine of grace? Not the individual experience of a grace, but what is grace in community? Can we have grace without having a community of shared kind of theopolitics? And oftentimes when we talk about grace, we keep it at the level of the individual. But our experiences interreacting with one another is grace, can we act for justice like we say we want to do in the church, in this church? Can we struggle toward a more just world by all of us individually having our grace moments, or collectively leveraging the power of those indwellings?
So if you think of it in scientific terms, because my mind
Yeah.
goes that way, you could use a metaphor of energy, that energy does not disappear. It becomes something else. And the same way with grace, personal grace. What does it become? Because it's not going to stay still. It's going to become something else because we are in time and space. So, I think that's where that liberation movement is at. I think it recognizes that sort of thing, and it's directed toward an end in their context.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
The men's group on Fridays is studying what's so amazing about grace.
Yeah.
But one of the illustrations that came out of that is the Truth and Reconciliation experience in South Africa. That is an expression of corporate grace, I would think.
Yes, and certainly its leadership was under Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Tutu, and that was, although they struggled with how to make it, how to create a kind of reconciliation process that would do justice to the victims and would get the perpetrators to move. And they weren't very successful at doing anything with the perpetrators. There was that collective airing of the truth of the past that led to...
But did it not stop a potential absolute race war?
Well, I think it was part of what stopped that, but there was also the moral leadership of Nelson Mandela and all of the negotiations that went on. It was part of that process, yes. But that would be a kind of collective experience of trying to create a place where people could bring their stories and be heard about what had happened under apartheid. And offer forgiveness. It's not too many of the perpetrators that asked for forgiveness. I mean, that's a difference in reading the narratives by the people who were on the victim side and reading some of the narratives, autobiographical narratives by people who were perpetrators and what they say about their responsibility or don't say about it. But yes.
I agree that we tend to think of grace as an individual thing. You know, we see it as an I feel grace, God's grace. But I do think that a social way that we receive it is through the church, through that service. And for me, nothing is more powerful than the Lord's Prayer, which we can say anytime, anywhere. But when we say it all together and the voices, everyone is saying it, there's no one really going louder than you know. It's just it brings such power to that Lord's Prayer when you're out and experiencing it alone. I just think it's a very social prayer.
I mean, that's certainly why the church is on that part of the economy of God's acts of grace, because it is the collective expression and receives collective knowledge about God's action in the world. I think that's true, but there might be other dimensions of the social that could be tapped. I don't know. You know, it's just food. It's just a question. It's just an issue to kind of ponder on. How do we kind of toggle between the individual and the collective and the social in terms of being open to the workings of grace. Okay.
My readings, I did quite a bit of reading on forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I came to the conclusion that the ultimate goal of forgiveness is community forgiveness. Although individual is fine, but really what you're striving for is community forgiveness. And as you're painting this,
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, well, that's probably true about grace too.
Mm-hmm.
We can all experience individual grace, but our real goal might be community grace.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, one thing that I think about is the communal nature of this whole thing, but I think the reason that Bonhoeffer is difficult for us is because he calls us to grace, but we're afraid of costly grace
Yeah,
because it can lead to martyrdom.
right.
And of course, has
It
right from
was for
Jesus'
him.
time through the martyrs in our own country, of which many of could be listed. Any of those South African leaders
Right.
that stood up
Right.
could easily have been martyred instead of imprisoned. And it just seems like that connection that we automatically make with taking our grace really seriously and extending it to others might mean paying the ultimate price.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have always admired Bonhoeffer, but I am also realize how far below his his capacity to live that faith out to the point
Right.
of death, which he did.
Which he did, yeah.
Is something that I think most of us find frightening, really. I mean, I don't know if my faith is that strong or capable.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what we're called to. But we don't talk about that hard part of it too much because it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's hard. And am I willing to the innocent people who marched for civil rights and who were slaughtered for
Right.
that, showing up at the Freedom Bus rides and then being killed
Right.
off the bus or whatever. I think that if you really take it seriously, the implications are very serious for us.
Yeah.
I've been reading recently writings by Teresa of Avila.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about your question about, we think of grace inside of us, but how does it get in there? So one of Teresa's books is about how, Jesus is already in all of us. So the sense that the grace is already there from the start inside of us, and we have to do the work to access. It's
Mm-hmm.
already there from the start.
Mm-hmm.
And also I'm going to mess up this quote, but she also said something like, God doesn't ask much, just everything you have.
Well, that kind of goes along with what I said.
Right, right. Well, this has been really interesting, and thank you for putting so much thought into how you think about grace and sharing that, actually. I really appreciate that. I'm sorry the technology gets in the way. I will make fewer slides for next time because I overproduce stuff, so I feel secure up here.
Sorry, it's kind of neat to see how your thought patterns behind you. And if we don't cover them.
That's right. So next week we're doing suffering. Suffering. And then the next week we're going to do mission. So I hope to see some of you back, and thank you very much. Thank you for all your thoughts and your attention. Yes, if anybody wants me to send the PowerPoints, I'll be glad to send PowerPoints. So I'm at sidsmith@umich.edu. All you do is have to email me. I'll just shoot you the